Back here on One, and it is our pleasure to be joined by veteran New York City sports writer. He has worked for the AP, Newsday, and the Hockey News. You can see him on Twitter at Denis Gorman. Dennis, how are you? Probably a little bit better now that hockey is back, right?
Yeah, it's good to have hockey back for sure. It'd been a long few months there without anything going on, so it's good to see hockey back.
I was just going to get into how has life changed for you with COVID and the NHL coming back, but in a bubble in Edmonton and Toronto, and how you've sort of kept up on things from afar.
Well, I mean, the individual teams in the league, they're just doing Zoom calls. There isn't any real availability in Toronto or in Edmonton, so unfortunately, there's no kind of point in being up there. There's no additional access. You can't go to the rooms to talk to a player. So you're basically doing a lot of Zoom calls, and hopefully you can talk to a team and they can maybe set you up with a guy over the phone. But that's kind of been about it.
And I want to talk a little bit about the specific design of the NHL with the bubble, because we've seen that it's been quite successful between them and the NBA in the utilization of bubbles. So from afar, what have you made of kind of the setup in Canada and how the NHL has been able to pull it off so flawlessly so far?
I mean, you got to give full marks to the NHL. I know a lot of people early on during the pandemic were critical that the NHL wasn't rushing back full bore, that it seemed like they were taking their time. But you can make the argument they were very pragmatic in how they went about developing their plan. When they picked the two cities, they were picking cities that had low cases of COVID, which obviously took New York out of the running at that time because we had a ton of cases. And at one point they were looking at Las Vegas, but the number of cases went up in Las Vegas. So they kind of settled on Toronto and Edmonton because they have the facilities and for the games and the practice facilities, and they were going to be able to essentially quarantine the teams in the hotels. So it's worked really well, and they deserve full credit. I mean, they've done a better job than the Major League Baseball has, for sure.
I wanted to get to some of the play on the ice, and some feared some rust for some players because of this long layoff. I'm not sure I've felt that way. How would you assess the quality of hockey so far in the NHL's restart?
I think it's been really good. It's not been preseason where you see guys kind of working the kinks out. Guys have kind of jumped in full bore, which has kind of been the good thing, because, it's been playoffs. It's not like they could take their time to kind of get used to each other. They've had the one kind of exhibition game, and then they've been playing, and the hockey's been good. I don't think anyone can complain about quality of play.
And I want to ask specifically about the Islanders. They're a team that has had a bit of an interesting run, I think, coming into the bubble. They lost those last 7 games before the season ended due to COVID-19, but they've gotten off to, I think, the best start you could probably ask for. I saw you tweeted something about that earlier. For the Islanders, up against the Panthers, they're playing right now as we speak. What do you think we're going to see from the Islanders finishing out this series, hopefully, and then in the future in the playoffs?
Well, right now they're up 3-1 in the middle of the second period. So broke a little news there. I think they're in a really good place right now. Their game, Barry Trotz has talked about it, their game travels well, whether it's at home, at the road, playoffs, because they play a responsible style, and playoffs is mostly about responsibility. You don't want to be the guy that tries to cherry pick and you get burned and the other team scores and your season's over. So I think they're in a good place. Plus, they had the chance to get guys healthy. They got Adam Pelech back. They obviously made the trade for J.G. Peugeot. He's had a chance to get kind of comfortable on the island. So I think they're in a pretty good spot right now.
I know that we and you pay particularly close attention to the Rangers as well. How disappointing is a 3-game sweep at the hands of the Hurricanes in the qualifying round?
I'm not sure it's disappointing in as much as it probably should have been expected. They had kind of like everyone, they had that break, but for them, I think it hurt them a lot because they had been playing pretty well right up to the break. and then you come back, and all of a sudden you're forced into playoffs against a team that last year went to the Eastern Conference Final. Certainly not having Igor Shesterkin for games 1 and 2 was an issue. And I think the bigger issue would be, and Chris Kreider talked about it after game 3. Game 1, they spent the first 5-7 minutes kind of running around in acting like they weren't going to be pushed around. Well, they spent a lot of time in the penalty box, and you're not going to score too many goals shorthanded. And by the time they got to game 3 is when they began to play Rangers hockey. But by that point, they're already down 2-0, and they had a lot of trouble, I guess, getting their game to their game. Carolina's forecheck, I thought, gave them a lot of problems as far as beginning to make the push up the ice. They kind of got trapped in their own end, and offensively, once they got into the Carolina end, they couldn't hang on to pucks. And so the Rangers are a rush team. That's how they make their living. But they also need to start adding some of those elements where they can play a cycle game and they can forecheck and hang on below the hash marks.
And that was kind of going to be where I was going to go with the next question. You talked about how it might be a little early to expect, playoff success from a young Rangers team. But where do you think they need to go in the offseason? Because they'll be in the mix for a solid draft pick. They're possibly going to want to add some defensive improvements. And like you said, alter the way they play to be a little bit more playoff sustainable. So what do you think the focus should be for the Rangers in the offseason?
Well, I mean, I think the first issue, and it's the biggest issue, is what happens with Henrik Lundqvist. He's got next year left on his contract, $8.5 million. Does he retire? Do they buy him out? Do they eat half of his contract and trade him to a team where he has a chance to potentially win a cup? That's the $8.5 million question. From there, you have to start looking then at guys like Tony DeAngelo and Ryan Strome. Do you up them long term? As talented as Tony DeAngelo is offensively, he's not the best defensive defenseman you will ever see, and he's probably looking for a fairly sizable raise. Do you trade him now when his value is at its highest, or do you re-sign him and then eventually move him to his offside, thinking that eventually you'll get K'Andre Miller and Nils Lundqvist, who can partner with him and kind of make up for his defensive shortcomings. And with Strome, you have to look at, he had a great year partnered with Artemi Panarin, but is it that he meshed well with Panarin, or did Panarin carry him? Because if it's the first, then you might say, okay, well, we can live with a 1-2-3 down the middle of Zibanejad, Strome, and then eventually Philip Heidel. If it's the latter, then you might look around to see, are there teams that would bid high on a Ryan Strome? So, and then you start kind of looking ahead to training camp. Does K'Andre Miller have a chance to make the team out of camp? I know Mark Stahl's got one more year left on his deal. So you start looking ahead like, well, maybe we can live with Mark Stahl for this season, and then next year they would have a lot of cap space with Stahl and Lundqvist off the books.
I want to get back to the bubble for a second. For those not familiar, a 24-team bracket, top 4 seeds in East and West are playing for seeding, the rest of 5-game qualifying round, and then into the playoffs. Is there a team from the bottom 8 that you could see making a run? Montreal with a 2-1 lead over Pittsburgh right now?
I mean, the team that I kind of look at as potentially making a run, the Islanders, the style they play, it plays well for the playoffs, and especially against some of the teams that that might be more offensive minded. They can stifle those teams and frustrate them. You look at a team like Carolina. Carolina was kind of in that mix in the 5-6, 5 through 12 range. They went to the Eastern Conference Finals last year. They haven't lost anyone, and they're probably going to get Dougie Hamilton back. And he was having potentially a Norris caliber season, at least offensively he was. So you kind of look at those teams as teams that could make a run. In the East, in the West, I'm a big Vancouver guy. They're able to skate, and they have enough firepower to make life difficult. And Jacob Markstrom has had a tremendous year in nets for them.
Yeah, and that's what I think is one of the interesting things about when you get 24 teams involved, and we've seen this across sports, the NBA, the MLS, and the NHL, is that you have so many good teams. And Barry Trotz mentioned this, kind of that parity across the league is what makes a format like this maybe something the NHL would consider in the future. So do you think the 24-team expansion is just going to be isolated to this year, or because of that type of success, it could be used again in the future?
I mean, I think you look at the success that they've had with these playoffs, you got to think they would really consider going to a 24-team playoff with the staggered starts, because right now, for hockey fans, this has kind of been their NCAA tournament. You've had games all day. You've had upsets. I mean, it's very conceivable by the end of the night, Pittsburgh, Toronto, and Edmonton are all out of the playoffs. And if you told someone a week ago that you won't have Sidney Crosby, Evgeny Malkin, Austin Matthews, John Tavares, Connor McDavid, and Leon Draisaitl playing in the first round of the playoffs, people would say you're out of your mind. But it's good. And I think it's healthy for the league. It puts more eyeballs on more teams in more markets.
You mentioned the playoff hockey. Many people will tell you that playoff time in the NHL is the best time of year, but 2020 will look a lot different without fans, and then the loss of home ice advantage for some of the league's top seeds, Boston, Tampa, St. Louis. How do you think that will affect things with the higher seeds not having that home ice advantage to rely on?
I'm not sure it will. I mean, it's not like these are young teams that haven't played playoffs before. St. Louis got to the Cup final. Boston's been to the Cup final. So I don't think it makes that much of a difference, especially when you look at the way the league has set it up. They've got the fan cheering, the fans, the audio fans cheering. They have the goal songs, and by and large, it's not like there's a massive difference in rinks. It's not the 1980s and early 90s where Boston Garden was 185 feet by 85 feet. Every rink is 200 by 85. So I don't think there's going to be a huge difference there.
And I mean, just from a fan perspective, playoff hockey is always one of the most electric atmospheres you can get in sports. So what has it been like for you just watching the game without any fans in a very different experience?
It is a little weird because you see a big hit or you see a goal, and you would expect to see people jump up and, pump their fists and scream. You haven't had that. But by and large, you look at the way the players have been, they haven't been going through the motions. They've kind of, as a lot of the players and the coaches have talked about, they've provided their own energy. So I think it's been a good thing. It's certainly not ideal, but the players, the teams and the leagues have made the best of not the best situation.
I won't ask you to pick a champion out of this 24-team madness, but if you had to choose two teams that are going to come out of each bubble, who would those be?
I'll go Tampa Bay in the East, and in the West, I like Vegas. I like what they've done, and Pete DeBoer is one of the more underrated coaches in the league. I think he's done a tremendous job. He did a tremendous job in San Jose, and people forget the job he did in Jersey, especially the year after the year after they went to the Cup Finals. They didn't have Parisi, they didn't have Kovalchuk, and he kept that team in the playoff mix right until March, which is a credit to him.
I definitely can't disagree with that. And I want to pivot over now to college basketball, because you were actually at the A-10 tournament, right, when it was kind of in March, and we didn't really know where things were going to go. And you look at where we are now from where we were then, no fans, things are on hiatus, college sports are in the balance, and we're in such a different world now. What was your thought process back then when the tournament was canceled, and how have you just reacted to things that have evolved since?
Well, it's interesting. A couple of days ago, I was going through my notes. I was going through my work bag, and I found the quote sheet from the day the conference canceled from the press conference, and I kind of thought back to that day a little bit where no one knew kind of what was going to happen other than tournaments had been canceled. But you thought, okay, well, they cancel, maybe they have to cancel the NCAA tournament, but by the end of April, they'll have this thing under control, and there'll be baseball, hockey will be back, NBA playoffs will be back. Maybe they restart the NCAA season. Now it's just completely bizarre, and it's really sad and tragic. You see the number of sick, you see the number of dead, and it's just I don't even have the words to describe what it is. Yeah. It's just unbelievable and depressing and shocking. And I think you start looking now, you have the NCAA talking about possibly not playing college football this season if they don't have if the numbers aren't better by, I think August 21 was the date that I saw. And now that's not too far away, so it's it's a really concerning time.
Yeah, it certainly is. And I was just going to ask, how optimistic are you that we'll be able to have a college hoop season come this winter?
Well, I'm not at all optimistic that we'll have a college football season. I'm not optimistic that we'll have an NFL season. College hoops, if they start in December or January, especially if there is, if not a vaccine, then at least a treatments, then maybe we'll be okay. The bigger issue is, to me, is the traveling aspect. If you're St. John's, you fly out to Indiana to play Butler. Well, do you want a bunch of kids jumping on an airplane during this time? How do you kind of guarantee their safety? How do you guarantee the safety of the coaching staffs? So on and so forth. And unfortunately, they won't be able to bubble, at least not until the NCAA tournament starts, or at least the conference tournaments and then the NCAA tournament. But I think it's all going to be dependent on whether or not there are treatments and how, and I give that maybe a 50-50 shot at best.
Dennis, I want to get you out on one more NHL question, because there has been a debate among those at WFUV Sports about the naming of the Seattle Kraken. How do you feel about that?
I think it's an interesting name, and it kind of ties into, obviously it's a city, it's a kind of a coastal-ish city, and kind of tying into like Lord of the Rings and that kind of thing. And so I think it's kind of a cool name. It doesn't bother me.
Yep, absolutely. Nick's on the other end of that. So
I'm on the other end of it. I didn't like it, but hey, to each his own, and I appreciate your take on the Seattle Kraken. Veteran New York City sports writer. He has worked for the AP, Newsday, and the Hockey News. Dennis Gorman with some great insight on the NHL and college hoops. Thanks so much for taking the time.
Thanks, guys. Glad to be on.
Thank you, Dennis.
Thanks.
We'll be back with more one-on-one after this.